Just a brief word of introduction about the organization. We are a company that focuses on research regarding leaders and their development. We've got good data about the impact of extraordinary leaders on the performance of organizations. For example, we found that those organizations whose leaders are truly exceptional have nearly 5 times higher profits, 70% higher employee engagement scores and productivity scores, roughly 40% higher customer satisfaction scores, and about half the turnover of other organizations. This brings us to the topic of today, which is about feedback. And you need it, and your employees want it. We'll begin today by just talking about what is feedback, and the reason why we chose this topic, I believe, is fundamentally this. We think that this ability to provide other people feedback in a constructive, positive way is probably the single leadership behavior that leaders find most difficult to practice. As I talk with people in large organizations, things that their leaders do well, things that leaders don't do so well, invariably the conversation comes back to our managers and leaders have a very difficult time, particularly giving corrective or redirecting feedback to other people. So we're going to talk about the importance of doing that. We're going to talk about how to give people feedback, what we know about who needs it, how they can receive it best. We're going to talk about both positive feedback, the virtues that it has. We'll talk about giving corrective or redirecting feedback, who benefits from that, and how to go about doing it, what the dangers are, what the barriers are. We'll try to do a thorough job of covering that. And for those of you who are on this call to kind of learn maybe something about how to improve your own feedback skills, we'll give you an overall formula to use that we think really helps those feedback conversations go better. So we're all talking about the same thing. We've defined feedback as information that one person possesses and decides that they'd like to pass it on to somebody else because they assume that that person, A, is not kind of fully aware of it, and B, would kind of benefit from knowing it.
It's interesting, Jack, because a lot of times as I see people performing badly, I say to myself, if somebody would just tell them, I mean, if they only knew what a dope they are, something like that. We ask people this question. I'm rarely surprised by corrective feedback from my manager. I usually know what I've done wrong. 73% of our respondents agreed with that. And it's interesting to me because if you're sitting there saying, if they only knew, my guess is 73% do. This isn't a surprise. But we assume they don't. We assume that if they only knew. And I think that might be.
And maybe what they don't know is how serious it is, how important it is, how much it really is standing in their way.
And not saying something sort of is a bad thing, too. So they don't. Sometimes they do know.
Well, again, we chose this topic because we thought it was the behavior that's been cited as the most needed interaction in organizations. Subordinates very much want it. They believe strongly that they benefit from it. And yet managers, for whatever reason, don't sufficiently provide it. So it's that kind of classic kind of demand is high, supply is short, and everybody benefits. We also want to talk about the fact that one of the reasons why managers may avoid giving it is that when it's done badly, it can do some harm. And there's some good research that says maybe in a third of the cases where somebody tries to give corrective or redirecting feedback to somebody else, it doesn't have a positive effect. So how do we avoid those, and how do we make sure that it is a successful interaction? So we know that success kind of teeters on this razor's edge, and we're going to do our best to kind of help push it over on that very positive side.
Thanks, Jack. One of the things that we want to talk about is we want to show you the evidence for why feedback is so important and the impact it has. A few weeks ago, I was with my daughter and my son-in-law, and we were driving, and there was an opportunity for us to talk. My son-in-law is just finishing his master's degree. He got a great offer for a new job, and in the car, he leans over to me and he says, Joe, what would you say is the one thing I ought to do to be more successful in my new job? And I'm like, what? Let me give you the 20. And I thought about that for a while. And what I came up with was, I would advise you, I would tell you that the one thing you ought to do is develop a habit of asking for feedback. Now, you go, well, okay, why would that be the one thing? And the point here is that when you develop a habit of asking for feedback, the possibilities of 20 things do come up because you're going to get the feedback. But let me show you the impact of asking, the impact of people who ask for feedback. We gathered 360 data, and we asked people to rate the effectiveness of their leader on actively looked for opportunities to get feedback to improve. If people didn't do that very well, if leaders didn't do that very well, and by the way, this is a study of 51,896 leaders, so it's a big study, global data set here. People that don't do that well, in the bottom 10 percentile, their leadership effectiveness is at the 15th percentile. They are some of the worst leaders. And people that do it well, you can see by the graph there, their leadership effectiveness, their overall perceived leadership effectiveness is at the 86th percentile. This ability to ask for feedback has an enormously positive correlation with your overall leadership effectiveness. And when you look at that, you would think, well, how does that look over time? If we look at this by age, what we see is that when people are young and new in their career, they're constantly asking for feedback. They're rated at about the 74th percentile. And you can see that at 26, they're just not quite as good. But then all of a sudden at 31 to 35, we get this big drop, and then it just goes downhill from there.
Complacency sets in.
It does. Well, and we assume we've heard it all. I've been there, done that, I know. And what is fascinating is to compare this between males and females. And what you start to see here is that for females, they maintain it. They do drop, but they maintain. They're above the 50th percentile throughout their career. But males, it's a steady falling rock down to the 40th percentile. And that's interesting. Does that have an impact? And one of the things when we look at the overall leadership effectiveness between males and females, we found that, in fact, women tend to be perceived as better leaders than men on 10 of 16 of the competencies. Men, they are better on 2, but you can see this ability to continue to ask for feedback. And one of the ways I've thought about this is women have this desire to sort of check in, and they don't assume they're perfect, and they assume that they might be able to improve. Men are walking around saying, gee, I'm God's gift to the world. People love me. Everybody thinks I'm terrific. Guess what? It's not true. We also looked at this by position, and we found out that the higher you go in the organization, the less you ask for feedback. What's fascinating is when you think about the feedback that you do get, I think senior managers and top managers are often told not what they need to hear, but people tend to tell them what they want to hear. Mm-hmm. So not only are they asking for it less often, but when people tell, oh, you are the best ever, they tend not to really get the real message. Well, there's this fascinating correlation. What we did is this interesting study where we looked at people who were let go from an organization. This is a study of 462 leaders in a Fortune 500 company. 77 of those leaders were let go. They were fired. The average tenure of those leaders was 18 years. So these weren't new people. They'd worked for the organization for a long time. And we looked at feedback they were given 2 years before they were let go. What we found is the leaders who were terminated were at the 41st percentile on makes constructive efforts to change and improve based on feedback from others. The leaders who weren't terminated were at the 52nd percentile. There's a significant difference between those two. There is some magic to asking for feedback. Ed Koch is a really good example of that. When he was mayor of New York, he used to go around and say, "How am I doing?" It seems like when you ask for feedback, it opens you up to that feedback. You become more, willing to hear the negative with the positive.
You've asked for it, and obviously you're going to get a lot more of it than you'd get if you didn't ask for it. So there's all kinds of things that work when you ask.
The other thing I think it does is when a person asks for feedback and they have that mode of wanting it, I think people are more willing to give them feedback when they think, well, this person ought to hear something. One of the things we asked people was we asked them this question: I feel that my performance and the possibilities for success in my career would have increased substantially if I'd been given more feedback. 64% agreed or strongly agreed with that. And so I think the process of asking puts us in a position of people volunteering the feedback. You don't always hear what you ought to hear.
That's right.
And sometimes people are walking around with toilet paper in the back of their pants and nobody says anything. That's a little embarrassing. So
right.
That's my big fear in life. Well, we'd like to give you a poll and a chance to hear what you think. What does it do when you ask for feedback? What do people assume? I was with a reporter and she had a particular view on this, but what's your view? You can see the poll on the side of the page there that you're looking at. We'd like you to weigh in on this. When a person asks you for feedback, what do you assume? Number one, are they incompetent? They don't know their job. 2, they must be desperate if you're asking for feedback. Number 3, you're brave and courageous, or they are brave and courageous. Or number 4, they are self-confident. What do you see in that? Well, the numbers are coming in, and they're quite profound. Only about 2% of the people say that when you ask for feedback, people assume you're incompetent. 4% say that they're desperate. But 42% say that when people ask them for feedback, they assume that person is brave and courageous. And 52% said that they feel that they are self-confident.
What I find fascinating about this is you wonder why it is in organizations that there's not more asking going on. If indeed it tends to be a strong signal that you're brave and courageous and that you're self-confident, why is it that so few people seek feedback from their colleagues and from their subordinates?
And a lot of times we just assume we're doing fine and someone would let us know if we're not.
Yeah.
And that's not always true. Well, let's think about this whole issue of asking. And what I wanted to do was look at the comparisons of which is better, which is more effective in terms of leadership effectiveness, asking for feedback or giving honest feedback. Both skills are very difficult. So we did a study, huge data set, 52,000 leaders. And what we said is if you were really good at asking but not very good at giving, what percentage of leaders that were the best leaders, 90th percentile, would have had that combination? We only found 5%. Well, maybe giving feedback has more of an effect. And then we looked at people that were good at giving honest feedback but not at asking, and what we found was 10%. Those numbers aren't very impressive. But then we looked at people that were good at both, good at asking and giving, and we thought, well, there's at least 15, but we ended up getting more than that. We ended up getting 81%. What we're looking at here is the combination of these two skills. Really, they sort of make the perfect leader, don't they? Your willingness to go out and say, how am I doing? But also that ability to really give honest feedback. So let's look at the other side of feedback, the side where you're giving it and the impact that has on people's ability and the engagement of employees. So let's start off with a poll. And this is a good one. Answer that question. I've had one or more negative anxiety-producing experiences receiving feedback. Do you agree with that or disagree with that? And part of what we're trying to understand here is I think people walk into a feedback experience with some preconceived notions and from some experiences that might not have been all that good. Well, about 85% agree. 85% of our audience out there walk into a feedback experience with some negative impressions, some impressions that it was difficult. And when we asked people if they had a difficult time giving negative feedback, we also found that they were much less likely to want to receive negative feedback. That experience of having difficulty giving it affected how they received it. So let's look at this. What we looked at was a person's ability to get feedback and what it did. And what we find from this study is that feedback is a powerful medicine. It can accomplish a great deal of good, and people want it. People want more of it, but it can also do some harm. And, it can have some negative effect. When we ask the question, negative feedback when delivered appropriately is effective at improving performance, 93% of our sample of 2,500 people around the globe responded positive to that. So we can see that people want feedback. They really believe that it's going to be helpful for them. But 65% reported they've had negative experiences.
85% said that they've had a negative experience, wasn't it? Yeah.
Right. So there's a big difference in the outcomes when done well. Let's show you the outcomes when it's done well. We ask people to rate their manager's effectiveness on gives honest feedback in a helpful way. And that's a good question at measuring it being done well. Again, if a leader with 5 or more direct reports, and this is over about 22,000 leaders here, if they were really bad at giving feedback in a helpful way, bottom 10%, the engagement, the level of satisfaction with your job and engagement, your willingness to do more, those employees were at the 25th percentile, bottom quartile. If people were great at it, they're at the 77th percentile. When we looked at percentage of people that think about quitting, again, gives honest feedback, top 10%, 15% of the people are thinking about quitting. The bottom 10%, 45% are thinking about quitting. Almost half of your employees think about quitting. And when we looked at this company provides excellent learning growth opportunities for my development, you can see the trend there, very significant trend. And finally, I'm treated fairly. Again, this ability to give honest feedback has a significant effect on a person's ability feel like they're treated fairly, and employees' ability to feel that. So one of the questions Jack and I were musing about was, we said, gee, over time you must get better at this. I mean, wouldn't an older leader, somebody who's had more experience, be better at giving feedback than a younger leader?
So we have shown them some data about asking for feedback in age. So
Right.
this is now giving feedback in age. So
Right.
it's a little bit.
We thought it would improve.
And we're asking everybody in the audience to kind of make their own vote.
And well,
And here's the answer.
we were wrong. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It declines over time, over age, and we thought, well, that's too bad. And then we thought that, well, surely senior leaders would be better than junior leaders.
As you get higher in the organization, you'd get better at this.
Well, certainly you give more feedback, so you'd have more practice, wouldn't you? And so we looked at it by position, and we found out, again, we were wrong, that the supervisors were better at giving honest feedback than top management. I think that is, both of those graphs are scary. And there's a bit of an indictment on our ability to really learn how to do it better. And so, Jack, well, help us out here. How do we solve this dilemma? How do people really give feedback in a helpful way?
So there are several questions that people face, that every manager faces when they get to this point of giving feedback. And the first one is, do I emphasize praise and positive reinforcement? And if I want to go on that side, what do I reward exactly? Do I reward their outcomes, or do I reward their effort and their tenacity? Second question is, when do I do that? And thirdly, do I attempt to do that pretty consistently with all the people that I work with, or do I treat people differently based on their tenure with the organization? And finally, so just how selective am I with giving feedback, different kinds of feedback to different people in the organization? So let's begin with kind of the easy one. Let's talk about giving positive feedback. First of all, the research confirms that positive feedback really has very beneficial results. So I want to encourage you who are kind of on this call, think hard about your propensity, your willingness to kind of give recognition and praise. We know that it has several effects, and you see them there on the screen. It creates people's good moods. People feel better about the organization and their job. It's very appropriate for certain people at specific times in their careers, and there are some very good and not so good ways of going about doing it. So let's kind of dig a little deeper into those questions. Who benefits most from positive feedback? The research is pretty clear that younger people, earlier in their experience in the organization, kind of novices in their jobs, greatly benefit from positive reinforcement. It helps them to develop confidence in themselves and their ability to produce well on the job. As they are in the process of building commitment to a project that they are working on, praise, reinforcement, positive feedback is a very powerful tool on the part of the manager in making that happen. We also have found that when not to give feedback is also pretty clear. If you're saying something of a praise, positive recognition message is going to be perceived as a signal to that person that, we've had success, no further efforts required. You don't want to do that, clearly. If you find that a very experienced person is underperforming and basically needs corrective feedback, then you probably don't want to give them praise and recognition and positive reinforcement. So there are some times to do it, and there are some times not to do it. In terms of how to give that positive feedback, there's been some really good research done about this, and I think most of us on the call would probably recognize the beginning piece is it needs to be specific. That just simply saying "atta girl, atta boy" doesn't help anything at all. But being specific about what you've observed, what the person has done, really helps. Now the question is, do you praise this person's intelligence and their creativity, or do you praise their hard work, their tenacity, their ability to overcome difficult challenges? And here the research is really, I think, very, very revealing. A woman named Carol Dweck, who had been a professor in Columbia and has recently moved to Stanford, has done some, I think, outstanding research on how the world tends to be a bit divided into two camps. People who believe that life is all about proving yourself, and those who are very much of the belief that life is about improving. And Dweck is convinced that this starts at an early age and may very well get started by how this individual has been reinforced and how they've been treated by teachers, parents, other authority figures around them. And she describes being in an airport one day and listening to a mother tell her little daughter how intelligent and creative and wonderful she was, and going over to the mother and saying, you know, you might want to really spend more time reinforcing the child's hard work, her effort, her tenacity, because when the child grows up and gets into school and encounters difficult problems, and she's not able to do them quickly and easily, what is she to think?
I'm stupid.
And I used to be smart and I'm not smart anymore, or mother wasn't telling me the truth, or whatever. Whereas if you've reinforced hard work and effort, there's just some wonderful research about this. So positive feedback is extremely valuable, done in the right way, with the right people at the right time in their careers. We think it's also important for the manager to express his or her personal appreciation to their colleague for the hard work that they've put in, for what they've been able to accomplish, but again, reinforce the right thing. Having said that, now let's turn to the more difficult side of this feedback question. And that is the question of how do you give corrective or redirecting feedback? Notice that we've not used the term positive and negative. And the reason why we haven't done that is that negative feedback can be positive, I guess is really what we're going to say. That, again, our research would indicate that many people recognize that some of the most valuable feedback they've received in their whole career has been corrective, has been redirecting. It is clear that managers find this much more difficult to deliver. We've seen a very high correlation between people's level of self-confidence and their comfort with giving corrective feedback to their colleagues. And at the same time, people recognize that this corrective feedback is really beneficial to them. And so how can we help people feel more comfortable, more confident in their ability to do that? Maybe just a word about who benefits the most. In contrast to the people that we mentioned earlier benefiting from positive reinforcement, and those people being maybe kind of new people, novices, just getting started, people who benefit from corrective feedback are clearly those experienced, seasoned, confident, committed to the job, to the project kind of people. These are people who can really benefit from having a manager sit down with them and talk about and giving them an objective view of their progress and their performance. And if that's done in a constructive, positive way, enormous benefits. Now, having said that, what about the relatively new person who could do something a little bit better, could do it a little bit differently, very often that feedback can be expressed as just instruction about how to do it to a person who's new on the job. But we're in no way suggesting that the manager should shy away from giving people honest, constructive feedback. What we're going to say, though, is that there's some ways of doing it in a way that is more likely to succeed than in another.
Jack, a few years ago, I heard a CEO talk about when he'd been promoted from president to CEO. And as president, he did a really good job of sitting down with his direct reports and giving them feedback on a kind of quarterly basis. But when he got the new job, he said, gee, everybody that reports to me is a president of a division. I mean, they don't need feedback. They're experienced. And so he stopped it. And when he got 360 feedback, it was resounding. You're not giving us any feedback.
Oh, well.
They really wanted it. Those seasoned, confident people, they really needed that reinforcement of, am I on track? Where do you see me doing? And he said that was a real surprise to him.
And no matter how high you go and what your position is, you still kind of need that.
You do.
Let's just say a word or two about these dangers. So we know that there's some research that says maybe 1/3 of the corrective, redirecting feedback doesn't have a positive relationship. It puts people in a negative mood. It has the danger of reducing their discretionary effort. And I guess I would particularly like to call attention to just this recent stream of research that I find very fascinating, which has to do with how the brain is wired. The brain apparently is wired to look for positive reward, positive experience, and it's also wired to avoid threat and danger. And when the human brain sees something in its environment that is threatening to its safety, that is perceived as being hostile or dangerous, within 1/5 of a second, the body responds. The endocrine glands excrete their output. Things just go bonkers, and people respond in ways that are not logical. And I would submit to you that there are a number of very basic human needs and emotions that a negative or corrective kind of message can trigger.
And this really kind of explains this interesting difference between how much people want corrective feedback and your own experience about giving it, which was it didn't seem like they wanted it. Yeah. They responded in a negative fashion. But these are the kinds of issues that come up for them, the kind of needs that are threatened, right?
And so I'm going to just review quickly with you 8 what we think are basic human needs that can very easily be threatened by a manager saying to a subordinate, you did something that wasn't exactly the best. Depending on how it's said and how it's done, this person can suddenly begin saying to himself or herself, oh, does this mean my future is in jeopardy? Is my ability to predict what's going to happen to me in the future kind of gone away? Is my ability to kind of be self-directing and self-managing now under question? Does what I do really make a difference? Is it being valued by the organization? Does this message that says that the manager is not exactly happy with what I've done or how I've handled a given task, does that mean that I'm going to be shunned as a member of this group? Is my inclusion kind of threatened by this? Does it have to do with, is my status in the organization going to suddenly be diminished? Am I going to be treated fairly? Is this criticism of me really consistent with what other people are receiving? I thought I had this warm and very friendly and intimate kind of relationship with my boss and with my colleagues, and now, based on what I've just been told, is that really being called into question? I had been really enthusiastic and been very engaged, and now is that suddenly kind of really now up for grabs? So it's very easy to see how almost any message that is corrective or is redirecting can trigger one of these responses. So we raise this only to say it is important, given all the benefits of feedback. We just need to know how does it get off track, and these are some of the things that we think cause it to get off track. We think it gets off track sometimes when the nature of the relationship between the giver and receiver is not very good. Most of us know that in a family situation, we can say things to a spouse or a partner that other people can't, and it'll be received relatively well. It'll be received in a positive way because we've got a lot of goodwill in the bank.
We hope.
We hope.
I found that's not universally
that
true.
That is
Jack.
not universally true.
And there's better times and worse times. So just FYI.
And in my situation, if I use the word feedback, I know it's not going to be a good conversation. I would never use the word feedback when I'm talking to my wife.
It was suggestion.
One of the barriers is that people don't always have don't have good skill in doing it, and so again, success depends very much on how this is done. We've got some interesting research that says that poor performers in organizations are often very good at avoiding those situations when they might be put in a position to be given negative feedback, and they're careful to orchestrate meetings with their manager so that they don't have those conversations.
It's almost like they know what's there, but if that person doesn't say it, then it isn't true.
Right.
What it is.
Right. And finally, if the manager has not set an example of asking for feedback, then it makes it much more difficult when he or she is in the mode of giving feedback to the people around them.
Again, the role model value of asking really does play huge.
Is very powerful. So in terms of offering some useful, we hope, practical suggestions, I guess it would be prepare for this conversation. Be clear about the ultimate objective. What are you really wanting to achieve? What do you want the outcome to be? And secondly, to take the time to create a plan for the conversation. And I'm going to talk with you just in a couple of minutes here about where we have a rough framework that we think is really applicable to most conversations of this kind. And if you follow that plan and you have a clear set of steps to take, your success is going to be incredibly improved. Thirdly, don't collect a whole bunch of things that you want to give somebody corrective feedback about. Don't come in with a whole gunny sack full of all the things you've collected for the last years, but limit it to one or two things that are really important.
Jack, there was a question here about recommending separating feedback from performance compensation.
And we would very much support that the more you can separate those conversations, that's why there's a difference between a good coaching conversation and a performance review. Performance reviews tend to be looking in the rearview mirror and kind of looking in the past. And obviously, we think that the objective of a feedback conversation between a manager and a subordinate ought to be, how do we make things better for the future? So it's really a future-oriented conversation. The final kind of bit of preparation is just take the time to rehearse, either mentally or physically, what you intend to do and what you intend to say. As you hear yourself say these things, you will say, "Oh, that's not going to come across very well. I won't say it."
That sounds really bad.
So let us share with you kind of the formula that we would propose that you might consider. We've called it the FUEL model, and it's the model that we have built into our coaching program, but we have also used this in programs that we've created for some companies on this subject of feedback. We have had this very very productive experience of working with 3 or 4 organizations in creating a specific training module for all managers on how they can have these kinds of conversations in a productive way. The FUEL model stands for framing the conversation, taking the time to understand what's going on currently, then together with the individual explore kind of what you'd like it to be in the future, and agreeing then finally on a series of steps, a series of concrete milestones, things that will happen. And so that combination of framing, understanding, exploring, and laying out a success plan we've called the FUEL model. And let's just take a moment or two to kind of talk about a couple of more elements that would help you to kind of get the picture of how that works. We think that particularly in a corrective, redirecting conversation, it's important that you begin the conversation with a signal that says, is this just a suggestion I'm passing on to you? Or is this a really serious issue that I want to talk with you about? Career threatening, has overtones about whether you're going to stay employed here or not. We think it's important to send that signal. Along with that, we think the other important element in this framing the conversation is that you make the whole conversation one of great respect, great dignity accorded to the receiver. That of all conversations you're ever going to have with anybody that really demand you treating them with respect, it's this one. So those are just a couple of thoughts around framing the conversation.
So if you walk into an office and you hear da 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 da, you know you're in trouble.
Not a good sign. But if it's the sound of music, then it's something else. Yeah. The second stage of this conversation, we think, is to understand the current state. Now, in a coaching conversation, the coach may be asking questions and trying to find out what the person is concerned about. In this case, where you're providing, redirecting or corrective feedback, you clearly have something on your mind, and you are going to want to say this and to convey this information. And we think that the ground rule here is you cannot pretend to know what's going on in somebody else's mind, what their inner attitudes or motives are, but you have the responsibility as a manager and certainly the privilege of describing what you've seen and what you've heard and what your conclusions are, and then to take the time to hear their perspective on what you've observed and their perspective on the conclusions that you've come to.
And people do the first part of that.
They sometimes dump the first part and then don't do the second.
Don't do the second part.
Don't do the second part.
It's like, let me tell you, but they don't ever say, so what do you see? Tell me your version of this. How
did this look from your point of view? And not remembering that there's always two sides to every...
And when you say that word respect, it's that second part that shows me you respect me. It's the fact that you let me say, well, here's how I saw the situation. Here's what I was trying to accomplish. Yeah. That makes a huge difference.
The third stage of this conversation, we believe, is then together kind of talking about, so as we go forward, and again, this is a forward-looking conversation, as we go forward, how would we want it to be different? And you've got the opportunity as the giver of this, this feedback to tell them your ideas about how it would look. But again, respect says you would seek the receiver's idea for what the ideal state should be. How would he or she want to do this going forward? But taking the time to do this will go a long way to having this be a successful feedback discussion.
And without that, you're just left with the feedback. This says, here's how we're gonna turn this around, here's how we're gonna make a success. If you don't do that, then shame on you, because you've just given negative feedback or corrective feedback, but not given a plan.
And now the research on the feedback would say that the real key to having it be a successful experience is not that you've just simply had a conversation where you've kind of shared some information with somebody, but that you've agreed on what you're going to do differently, and that you've agreed on some concrete, palpable kind of steps that they're going to be taken, and what each person needs to do and how it's going to be monitored. And if you'll do that, then this conversation has had a purpose, it's had a positive outcome, it's got a high probability of success, it's going to really make a difference. It isn't just a matter of me kind of venting my frustration or my unhappiness with what the other person has done. So those are the elements, we believe, of a very productive feedback conversation. So we would now invite you to kind of, Joe's going to talk about this feedback instrument that we have created. And so, Joe, kind of.
I'm sure at this point everyone is sort of asking themselves, well, how effective am I at giving feedback or receiving feedback, positive or corrective? What we've created is an assessment that measures your preference to prefer it, or you'd like it, or you tend to avoid it. I'd invite you to go on. You're going to get an email. Terry's going to send out an email that gives you this opportunity to go in and do this assessment. And you can measure your desire and your preference for getting and receiving the feedback. Now, on this slide, what you'll see is our normative data here. And what's really fascinating is the extent to which people want to receive corrective feedback. As you notice, the preference for receiving corrective feedback is twice as high as the preference to give corrective feedback.
Well, we really encourage you to do this at the conclusion of this webinar. So as we move to our conclusions today, let me just kind of review quickly. We think there's a huge need and opportunity here. Again, it seems to be the behavior that as managers and leaders in organizations we shy away from, and it's the one we just don't find comfort doing. And yet everybody kind of needs to have that. And so whether it's peers talking to peers, whether it's bosses talking to subordinates, we think that this willingness to provide both positive and corrective or redirecting feedback is powerful. We believe it can be learned. Our experience in working with our client partners here has been they've had great success with people learning to do this skill well, getting comfortable with it, getting confidence, because we think that confidence is equally as important as competence in this matter. If you're not confident, then you're not going to probably do it, and that's kind of what's happening now. So we're trying to build both the confidence and competence, and that comes from having practiced and really knowing a good track to follow. So we have, as we mentioned, kind of created this a program called Elevating Feedback. It's being used by several organizations. We're happy to kind of answer questions about that, give you any more information that you would like. But we are confident that this is a skill that can be taught. It's targeted to new managers. It's targeted to senior level executives. It's a half-day, interactive, instructor-led skill building program. Wonderful video that shows behavior modeling examples of supervisors doing it well. And we know that it really does change behavior. Thanks so much for joining us today. We very much appreciate it.